So welcome to the HKS Energy Policy Seminar. I'm Joe Aldy, and I'll serve as the host today. Thrilled to see the standing room only crowd joining us here in Rubenstein 414, and equally thrilled to have so many friends and colleagues joining us online via Zoom. We're really excited to have with us today Dan Lashof for his talk on land use and the role of biomass in addressing our greenhouse gas emission goals. Dan is the director of World Resources Institute, United States. He coordinates WRI's work in the US across climate, energy, food, forest, water, and the Sustainable Cities programs. This includes overseeing the work of the US climate team, which aims to catalyze and support just and equitable climate action by the federal government, states, cities, and businesses while promoting US climate leadership internationally. Previously, Dan was the chief operating officer of NextGen Policy Center and served as the director of the Climate and Clean Air Program at the Natural Resources Defense Council. Also, we're thrilled to have Dan back as an alum. He earned his bachelor's degree in physics and mathematics here at Harvard and his doctorate from the Energy and Resources Group at the University of California, Berkeley. Dan, welcome back to Harvard and welcome to the Energy Policy Seminar.
Okay, thank you. Thanks, Joe. Thanks for having me. Thanks all for coming. I realize many of you are here for the free food, but it's a great way to get people in. I am here. I want to talk about a topic that I think is fundamental to the issue of how we create a positive future for people, nature, and climate, but that gets far too little attention in the policy community on these topics. So here's a brief overview of what I'm going to do. I'm going to start with a global perspective on land use and quickly review some of the global energy modeling that has been done that looks at the implications of land use and the implications of energy use for land. I'll dive into work that we're doing, work in progress at WRI to shed light on how to optimize land use and particularly biomass use in the context of achieving net zero emissions in the United States. And so to preview my conclusions, if you take three things away from this talk, I hope they are: one, land is scarce; two, biofuels dominate all other energy sources in terms of the implications for land use; and three, biomass carbon is too valuable to burn. So let's get started. We take a global perspective on land use, and the WRI's food program has published extensively about how to create a sustainable food future, and I'll be drawing on that. But the first point is just observation. The world is continuing to expand the area that we consume for agriculture. And this shows land use trends by period. And you can see particularly in Africa and in South America and in Asia, land use is expanding by millions of hectares every year. Trends may be going up. The rate of change may be going up or down from one period to another. But even in North America and Europe, there's net agricultural expansion in the most recent period. So we are continuing to clear natural ecosystems to expand agricultural production to meet growing food needs as the world's population grows and as the world gets richer and demands more protein. This is another look at it. So area of crop is coming about half from forests and natural vegetation and half from pasture and previously abandoned agricultural land. And you can see that the net change is about half of the gross conversion to agriculture. But when land goes out of agriculture, it primarily goes back into pasture, primarily into pasture, and only a little bit is being restored into forest or other natural vegetation. So we're continuing to clear land for agriculture. and as I mentioned, WRI has looked at how we would reverse those trends. And to cut a long story short, involves reducing the demand for agricultural products and or for the land needed to produce agricultural products by reducing food loss and waste, and by shifting diets towards more plant-based diets, and particularly away from beef, are the biggest factors. This is the phase out of crop-based biofuels. It's a relatively modest wedge here, but what it suggests when you look at the whole requirement here to try to actually get some land that we could restore for carbon sequestration and biodiversity preservation, there's certainly no room to expand this. I'll take a look at it one other way in terms of greenhouse gases. So same set of measures, reducing food loss and waste, shifting diets, et cetera, and then increasing productivity on the land that we are using. And then there's, in this case, specific emission control requirements. But when you put all that together, the land area of something like 600 million hectares needs to be restored to natural vegetation just to compensate for the residual emissions from the agricultural sector, let alone do carbon removal for any residual emissions in other sectors. So again, the bottom line here is the land is scarce. So now let's take a look at bioenergy and how that fits into the global energy system. And of course, biomass was the very first energy source used by hominids when fire was put to use roughly 1 million years ago. Nobody's sure exactly how long ago, and it was the largest share of global energy consumption until about 1900, when it was overtaken by coal, then by oil, then by gas. Now, clearly, to achieve net zero emissions and meet the world's climate goals, coal, oil, and gas need to be supplanted by non-emitting sources, and very quickly compared to with this historic timeline, something like the next 30 years. Based on economics alone, that's primarily going to be wind and solar, at least in the power sector. But that leaves a question of how do we deal with liquid fuel demand, things like sustainable aviation fuel, which I'll talk about in a minute, and raises the question about this very small but growing source down here called modern biofuels. So modern biofuels, it's typically things like ethanol made from corn, currently ethanol made from corn, or a diesel fuel made from vegetable oil. And when I talk about biomass, I'm also including woody biomass, such as the use of wood pellets to make electricity, which I think will be phased out because there's a lot of cheaper ways to make clean electricity. But that's so that's right now small, but different models have very different projections of what happens to biomass energy going forward. So this is a set of global models looking at net zero emissions by different dates, compiled by the Energy Transitions Commission. And you can see a very wide spread. But I would focus particularly on the International Energy Agency scenarios, which are quite influential here, net zero by 2050, and this one by 2070. Both of those scenarios have over 100 exajoules of biomass energy at the time net zero is reached, which is a big increase over current consumption of bioenergy in the sort of modern uses of something like 30 exajoules. Now, there are other scenarios where it stays much smaller. Some of those assume very significant behavioral change, like IPCC pathway 1. That's relatively small, but questionable whether all those things are going to happen. So let's compare that sort of 100 plus exajoules number to what the Energy Transitions Commission calculated as a prudent supply, where they say we should not be using crop-based biofuels, but what else could we use? They include some non-crop-based dedicated land, such as growing switchgrass on marginal land. I'll talk a little bit more about that. Woody biomass, agricultural residues is an important source, as well as municipal solid waste. And that gives you a total production, and these are pretty rough estimates, 40 to 60 exajoules, of which about half is needed for materials. And again, depending on whether you have any of these sort of dedicated lands and the uncertainty, that gives them 30 to 50 exajoules of what they would call prudent biomass, compared with over 100 in the IEA scenario. So there's a disconnect there. So with that background, I want to dive into optimizing the use of biomass in the US. And as I mentioned, this is research that's ongoing at WRI. It's a work in progress with a couple of co-authors that we're in the process of trying to publish as a WRI report. Should be out hopefully by the end of the year or shortly thereafter. So I'll give you a sneak peek of that. So the first point is an observation that the US uses about 1/3 of its corn and soybean acres, which is prime farmland, to produce fuel. So corn ethanol, about 30 million acres, and less well recognized, but equally important, is soybean diesel fuel, made from soy oil, also about 30 million acres. And it's widely distributed across the grain belt, as you would expect. And let's compare that land use to the land required to build renewable electricity sources. So this is a very useful graphic produced by the National Renewable Energy Laboratory, and it compares the area for solar and wind required to get a net zero electricity grid by 2035. And for wind, I would just point out, so the small square in the middle, the orange, is the amount of area directly occupied by the turbines, turbine towers. And the larger square includes the full area of the wind farm. So it can be considered affected by the wind farm or not. The point being, a lot of this area is in the Midwest, and people farm right up to the base of the towers. So you get a multiple use there. So in my view, this kind of smaller area is what's important. But depending on the location of the wind farm, you may be worried about other ecosystem impacts, and obviously people worry about visual impacts. So, but let's compare that to corn ethanol here in terms of area, or even to roads or the footprint of buildings. And the conclusion is that the area you need for these key renewable electricity technologies is small by comparison. Now, that doesn't mean there aren't significant legitimate siting issues that have to be dealt with at any particular location to make sure that those are sited in a way that does not have environmental or other impacts that you want to avoid. But it means in terms of pure acres, the issue is dominated by biofuels. So the Nature Conservancy has gone a step further in looking at siting renewable energy in a series of reports called The Power of Place, which I commend to you. So they created an environmental impact index for each acre in the United States, and they looked at what would be required to reduce that impact within the context of achieving net zero emissions by 2050. And what it requires is both some changes in siting and also some shift in the technology mix. So you would do a little bit more solar, a little bit less onshore wind. They're looking mostly at the full footprint of wind as opposed to just the area covered by the turbines. And what they find is that you can get a 70% reduction in this environmental impact index with a very small increase in the net system cost of the energy system to achieve that through these kinds of techniques. And then you can see the areas here on onshore wind, co-location of wind and solar, agrivoltaics, which means you've got solar panels that are elevated so you can farm under them, and then other solar technologies. So this is quite interesting, but they did not look at biofuels in any detail in this study. It's implicit in the model, but they didn't compare the land area or the siting of biofuels or other biomass. And if you look at the area that we are currently dedicated to biomass, in these units, 94,000 square miles compared to, say, which is all highly productive cropland, compared to around 5,000 square miles in their 70% impact reduction case. So dominated by these crop-based biofuels that we're currently producing, let alone any increase. So WRI wanted to pick up where the Nature Conservancy left off, and we've been consulting with them as well along the way to ask 3 research questions. One is, what is a sustainable supply of biomass? How much could we get without competing with food production? And if we include a measure of the opportunity cost of using cropland for biofuels, how does that affect the mix of energy sources achieving net zero emissions? And given different scenarios of available biomass with these different sets of constraints, then what are the optimal uses of that biomass? I'll try and go into that. So I'll give you some results from that work. So to do that, we used an energy optimization model called from Evolved Energy Research called Rio and Energy Pathways. It's the same model that the Nature Conservancy used in their study, and also that the Princeton Net Zero America study, if you're familiar with that, has used. So it's a well exercised optimization model. We started with the 70% impact reduction scenario that I just showed you from TNC. We have a high biomass scenario, which is derived from the biomass available in a report from the Department of Energy, Oak Ridge National Labs. They've been updating every 5 years for a while, called the billion-ton study, which, guess what, suggests that there's over 1 billion tons of biomass available, but does not have, in our view, sufficient constraints on land use in doing that. The medium biomass case is from a more recent report from Livermore National Lab called Roads to Removal, that looked in detail at how to achieve the carbon removal necessary to achieve net zero. They looked at technological carbon removal as well as bioenergy or biomass sources. We use their biomass supply curves, which have somewhat more constraints. And then we also added a carbon opportunity cost for the use of land for crop-based fuels to reflect the leakage of emissions from diverting that food into the fuel market. I'll talk a little bit more about that. And then, as I said, it's work in progress. The medium scenario includes some dedicated use of what Livermore considered marginal land for bioenergy crops. We're going to do another case where we take that supply away on the argument that there really isn't such a thing as marginal land. It's pasture land probably now, but uncertainty about how much of that there really is. There is some opportunity to use conservation reserve program acres and to harvest that on a periodic basis while maintaining that. So that would not be competing with other land uses because it's already out of production for either food or feed. So we'll keep that in, but we'll have a more conservative estimate there, and also a more conservative estimate of the supply of woody biomass. Don't have results for that yet, but that would be another case. So just another word about the idea of the carbon opportunity cost of land. So this is from a 2018 paper in Nature, and it compares the estimated carbon cost of, in this case, corn ethanol. This is on a per kilometer basis, so using it for transport for passenger vehicles, to solar PV running a battery electric vehicle. And the conclusion is, when you account for the carbon opportunity cost, that the implicit emissions from using corn ethanol are hundreds of times higher than using solar. And the basis of that is to say, if you have to produce land to produce agricultural products, produce meaning convert it from the original use in a natural ecosystem to agriculture, then there's emissions associated with that, clearing the above ground vegetation as well as loss in soil carbon. And you amortize that over a 30-year period of production, and that gives you an estimate of an annual emissions that is attributable to a biomass crop that's grown on farmland. So that's one way of estimating a carbon opportunity cost. The other way, which is maybe more intuitive, to say if there really were spare land that we don't need for food production, then you could reforest that land or convert it back into a native ecosystem, and that would sequester carbon for a period of time. And you can make an estimate of how much carbon it would sequester. So not doing that, again, is the opportunity cost of using that land for biofuels. Those numbers turn out to be relatively similar. And in both cases, the conclusion is that the emissions per gigajoule of fuel from a crop-based biofuel, whether it's corn or soy oil, is actually higher than petroleum. It's a controversial finding, and I'll give some sensitivity cases as a result, but that's our starting point for the carbon opportunity cost. So here's our very clear results. Let me just spend a minute explaining what we have here, and then I'll break it down with some other results. So this is the high biomass case. This is a case where we do not have carbon opportunity cost included. You can see food crops are still in the system. And this is the total use of biomass measured in exajoules in this case. So the key sources are agricultural waste, municipal solid waste, in this scenario, food crops, forestry waste and residues, herbaceous energy crops. So this is energy crops grown on marginal land, and woody biomass, which is in this case mostly wood that is being moved from western forests to reduce wildfire risk. The current thing that's done with that wood is it's put in a pile at the edge of the forest and burned. So that is a pretty good thing to do something else with from a climate point of view. So those are the inputs, goes through various spaghetti diagram conversions here, and then the end uses are a variety of things, but I'll point to a couple things. Here, aviation fuel is a significant use. That is coming from food-based crops, which are no longer needed for road transport as we electrify the road system. So you're making aviation fuel. Then there's a chunk of biomass here that is used for chemical production, asphalt and petrochemicals. So that carbon in the biomass is very valuable for that use. So that's here. And then there's this big chunk called direct sequestration, which is essentially taking, in our case, we restricted this to woody biomass, the woody biomass waste, say, from the western forest, as simple as digging a deep hole and burying it so that the carbon does not get released to the atmosphere, that's sequestered. And this is kind of a somewhat surprising finding, hasn't been featured in a lot of previous studies as a major use of biomass, but we find that it's quite cost effective. So now just comparing the high biomass case to the medium case, again, this one uses a more restricted set. You see the total amount of biomass is less. There's no food crops in this case. There is still some herbaceous energy crops, a smaller amount based on the constraints here. So the end uses are similar. In particular, you still have this very significant direct sequestration component. You will notice that aviation fuel has disappeared from the set of end uses. Chemicals are still a major source, and there's hydrogen production as well. So let's take another look. These are the same scenarios focusing on the use of kind of the end use. So the right-hand side of the previous diagram. So you see kind of the current uses, corn ethanol and biomass used in wood. Under current policies, there's not a big growth in use of biomass. There's no driver for it. But under a net zero constraint, in high biomass, you still have the corn ethanol component, but then you are adding a significant biomass sequestration component. And this one is fast pyrolysis, hydrogen Fischer-Tropsch. So this is conversion of biomass thermochemically for either carbons, primarily for chemicals, but also for synthetic fuels. And then in the medium biomass case, you see the yellow wedge disappears. You have somewhat similar, although they're somewhat smaller, but largely similar amounts of biomass sequestration and the chemical and liquid fuel end uses. So looking specifically at ethanol, the current use is ethanol blending with gasoline. We blend about 10% of all gasoline is a mix of 10% is about 10% is ethanol in the mix, and that goes away almost to zero because in pretty much any net zero scenario, we're going to nearly 100% electric ground transportation. And so then the question is, what happens? And if you do not include a carbon opportunity cost from the land used to grow that fuel, then what happens is the ethanol is converted into jet fuel and used for aviation. On the other hand, when carbon opportunity cost is included, it is phased out, and that corn production is able to re-enter the food market. So, as I said, the specific estimate that we're using of carbon opportunity cost is controversial. So we looked at a sensitivity case of the cost of ethanol to jet versus a sort of benchmark of a carbon neutral jet fuel, which you can imagine as being electrolytic hydrogen combined with direct air captured CO2. All these are quite a bit more expensive than fossil jet if you don't count the carbon emissions of the fossil jet. And what we find is that this is the number we use, but even down to about 20% of that carbon opportunity cost estimate, the net cost of from sort of carbon emissions plus monetary cost of ethanol to jet is higher than e-jet. So the e-jet pathway is favored over a wide range of carbon opportunity costs. And then I'll say a little bit more about the carbon sequestration, direct sequestration. So a lot of previous studies, for example, the Princeton study that I mentioned, really emphasize biomass conversion to hydrogen, which you could do by gasifying. Biomass could be woody biomass, agricultural waste. Gasify that, do a water shift reaction, you make hydrogen and CO2. And if you then sequester the CO2, you can produce, you achieve both carbon removal and clean hydrogen, or you can think of that as carbon negative hydrogen if you like. So we looked at the net cost of carbon sequestration from that hydrogen pathway in the model in the blue versus direct sequestration, which are here is a high and low estimate. And what it finds is that, you know, potentially much cheaper, but even at the higher estimate, significantly cheaper than making hydrogen. On average. Now, we still have some hydrogen production because it's very valuable and you need a source. Arguably, that could be all electrolytic hydrogen, but we're finding that this pathway does still enter the solution, but in general is more expensive than direct sequestration. And then just some conclusions about the land area. Here in these scenarios, purpose-grown biomass, so this is right now, under current policies, this is the food crops. In the high biomass scenario, it's both food crops and land dedicated to producing herbaceous biomass material. In the medium biomass scenario, it's just the marginal, so-called marginal land. And you can see that even with that, this is substantially more land than the direct land required for wind or solar. If you include the full area of the wind farms, then wind becomes larger. But again, as I said, we think this is still somewhat suspicious in terms of dedicating that much land. So we'll be running another case where that is further reduced. Okay, I'm going to conclude with a couple of policy conclusions here based on this analysis. So as I said at the beginning, first conclusion is that biomass carbon is too valuable to burn. Its highest priority is probably in chemical feedstock or as a contributor to direct carbon removal. And potentially a hydrogen production. Again, you're not burning the carbon part would be sequestered in that pathway. And then if you incorporate the carbon opportunity cost of land use dedicated to growing biomass, then we should not be dedicating land. We should be sourcing biomass from residues and wastes. Corn ethanol and soy biodiesel would be phased out as the road transport fleet electrifies. And so what are the policies that flow from that? It suggests that research and development efforts should really focus on better utilizing wastes and residues. And we still need guardrails around that because, for example, corn stover, which we produce several 100 million tons a year of, some of that residue from producing corn needs to stay on the field to maintain soil quality, but most of it could be collected and used for energy or materials or carbon sequestration. So what that means is that the main sources of biomass, there are some waste oils called fog, sometimes fats, oils, and greases. So think of used cooking oil. In the old days, that was what was biodiesel. That was what biodiesel was. It smelled a little bit like French fries. We're using all the waste oil that the world has, basically. And in fact, we're probably using more than that it's being called waste oil. There's documented cases of fraud because, for example, in the California Low Carbon Fuel Standard, waste oils have a much lower carbon emissions intensity than any of the other fuels. There's a very strong incentive to take a vat of virgin vegetable oils, dip one French fry in it, and call it waste oil, and get that credit. And that's there's documented cases that things like that have happened. So California is trying to adopt better chain of custody requirements to prevent that kind of fraud in the future. As I said, corn stover is a big resource. Wildfire risk reduction thinnings and then forestry residues and municipal solid waste. That's still a lot of biomass available without having to dedicate land to biomass production. And that has implications for what federal policy should be. There's pretty generous tax credits in the Inflation Reduction Act for producing biofuels, some specific for sustainable aviation fuel. And the guidance for that that came out last year for the current version of that tax credit is sort of a compromise, has some land use impacts, but very low. And it makes it difficult to use corn ethanol to make aviation fuel and qualify for the tax credit, but it doesn't make it impossible, particularly if you do carbon sequestration at the ethanol plant, it would qualify under those rules. The Treasury Department is writing new rules for a slightly different version of the tax credit that goes into effect at the beginning of next year. We'll see what those look like. We're engaged in trying to convince them to more fully account for the carbon opportunity cost of land when they do that. The other main federal policy is the Renewable Fuel Standard, which is a volume-based requirement. Initially was basically all ethanol. The idea of it was there was supposed to be a transition from making ethanol from corn to using advanced biofuels, which were supposed to be from cellulosic material. So the requirement basically is 15 billion gallons of fuel that could be made from corn or other biomass, and then the rest of it, which was supposed to be another, was supposed to get you up to 36 billion gallons overall. So 21 billion gallons was supposed to be advanced biomass, but that never came to fruition or hasn't yet, and EPA has had to waive that requirement year after year. There's a little bit of what they're calling advanced biomass in the system. But the fundamental problem with that, and advanced biomass was supposed to achieve at least a 50% reduction in greenhouse gas emissions on a per acre basis. You still have the problem of measuring that and the argument over what land use emissions you assign to fuel, depending on what the biomass feedstock is. And the other problem with it is that as a volume-based requirement, it doesn't give you an incentive to make continuous improvements. So we'd like to see that replaced with something more similar to the California Low Carbon Fuel Standard, which bases the credit that you get on your net impact on greenhouse gases. That doesn't solve the problem of the debate about how you measure those greenhouse gas impacts, but at least it sets up the right discussion going forward. So with that, hopefully I convinced you that land is scarce and that biomass dominates all other energy uses of land, and that the carbon in biomass is too valuable to burn. Thanks.
Great. Thank you. So we'll take questions. I suspect, given how crowded the room is, there may be a few out here. So I want to see if anyone wants to jump in immediately before I go in. Yes, over here, please.
Thank you for being here. I want to start with a very basic question, which is I would love to have a copy of this presentation because it's so incredible, incredibly information dense and so well synthesized from all of these different sources. One thing that struck me at the beginning, and I'm not sure how much this underpins the analysis for U.S. land use, is that it seems like WRI is relatively pessimistic about increased gains from increased yields in terms of what needs to happen to land use, or what needs to kind of change under current situations from the current situation in order to get to net zero 2050 with land use. And so I'm wondering, if you could speak for a couple minutes about that and what you think the potential is, especially in the developing world, for increased yields to meet this challenge.
Great. Well, thank you. And we're actually not pessimistic about increased yields. It's a significant wedge here in this graph. I didn't emphasize it enough probably in the talk. We just think that those increased yields are going to be needed to feed the growing global population that is also demanding more protein. So, that's really not freeing up land. It's just allowing us to meet the needs of agriculture as the primary use. But yes, I mean, we are, I would say many environmental groups don't focus on increasing productivity of the land that we're using, because we talk about organic agriculture or whatever, and there's obviously a bunch of environmental impacts from agriculture that we worry about as well. But we do view productivity increases as actually a positive thing for the environment, and think that policies to promote that are helpful.
Thanks, Dan. That was great. Jim Stock. This carbon opportunity cost of land seems, it would be helpful if you would discuss this just a little bit more. It seems to be a somewhat different concept than what maybe we're used to. The standard approach is to ask what's the cost of indirect land use change, or direct land use change and then induced indirect land use change, where there's going to be, if you expand the amount of biofuels production, then maybe there's some more acreage, and then that acreage is going to be converted from something, and then you decrement in some way based on some estimates. And this seems to be a different concept, comparing it to some sort of optimal allocation or something along those lines. I wonder if you could, that seems to be driving the use of this opportunity cost, seems to be driving these results. And if you use the standard indirect land use change, you get, for example, ethanol being less carbon intensive over the life cycle, depending on sequestration and so forth, than gasoline, and you find the opposite here. So maybe you could elaborate on this a little bit more and then defend this concept. And I suspect that that's one of the things you mentioned, the Treasury, one of the things that's absolutely central to the low carbon fuel standard tax credit allocation is exactly this issue. And so why should they go from the standard approach to this carbon opportunity cost approach?
So that's correct. The standard approach used in policy by EPA and the renewable fuel standard rulemaking, by Treasury for the tax credits, and by California in the low carbon fuel standard is to do a life cycle assessment where they use something called the GREET model for the process emissions. It's a model developed at Argonne National Laboratory, and it calculates, how much fertilizer went into producing the fuel. It calculates how much energy is used at the biorefinery, if that's not a renewable source, if there's fossil fuel. That calculates how much fuel is used by the trucks to bring the fuel, bring the biomass to the plant. That part's not particularly controversial. Some uncertainty there, but not that much. Then they actually use a separate model to calculate a indirect land use change emission factor. That's where the controversy lies. The model that's used currently for that purpose is called GTAP. It calculates a number at about 10% of the number I gave you. So yes, that's very consequential. As I said, with our sensitivity costs, even at 20% of the number that we used, we would still find it's not doesn't make sense to make aviation fuel. But if you go down to 10%, yes, you would see aviation fuel from ethanol. The issue with the GTAP model is it is an attempt to calculate the net effect on the global land use decisions, right, from changes in prices that are induced by increased demand for biofuels. So conceptually, one thing that's a little odd about this is the life cycle assessment is combining what's the GREET model, which is called a consequential life cycle assessment. I'm sorry, that's a consequential life cycle assessment with this model that includes all kinds of economic feedbacks, which is an attributional assessment. So from the beginning, there's some inconsistency there about how those two work, because if you used a attributional, no, I got it backwards. That's why it's complicated. But anyway, so if you used a consequential analysis for replacing gasoline with biofuels, that by doing that you would, on the margin, reduce the price of gasoline, and there would be some rebound effect that would increase gasoline consumption. EPA doesn't consider that. GREET does not have that in there. But when it comes to the land use part, those kinds of feedbacks are included. And one of the more perverse ones is that increasing the use of crops for biofuels increases the price of food, which means that people eat less. So some of the benefit that's attributed to biofuels, when you dig into the details, is literally from people eating less food. And just as a policy matter, we shouldn't do that. So our concept is, let's use something that's more consistent with the attributional approach that GREET takes for other parts of the life cycle assessment, and say, what is the emissions associated with producing the land that you use to make fuel? So in a life cycle assessment, if you have to build a factory to produce batteries, the emissions associated with building that factory would be considered part of the life cycle emissions, and you would calculate that over some period of the useful life of the factory. Farmland is created by converting natural ecosystems, and so we take an estimate of the emissions from that, and also, which is basically you're clearing the above ground biomass, you're reducing soil carbon. That's a chunk of emissions, again, amortized over a 30-year period, and that creates an annual emissions that goes into the calculation the way we do it. So that's the conceptual difference between the two. It is, I mean, I would say, why is it controversial? Well, in the short run, farmers are like, I've got all kinds of extra crops, so maybe there is no land use implications of converting it to food. We're really taking a global, long-term perspective on this, where there is no such thing as spare land. Hopefully that helps.
I was wondering how nuclear fits into the picture from a policy point of view. It seems like the US should subsidize nuclear, use electrolysis to produce any e-fuels and feed the demand for liquid fuels in that way. So how does nuclear fit in?
Yeah, so nuclear is one of the candidate technologies in this model. It does not, in this particular set of assumptions on cost and performance, it doesn't increase substantially from current levels. It does increase a little bit. It kind of maintains its current market share of a little under 20%. And that's an economic issue, right? Is nuclear going to be competitive with other zero emission technologies? And I think based on current economics, for the bulk of electricity generation, somewhere around 80%, it's going to be wind and solar. They just blow everything else out of the water in terms of cost effectiveness. But you do need to get a complete net zero electricity grid. You need some sources that are dispatchable, which we call clean firm power. And I think it's an open question where that will come from. Nuclear is one possibility. We should be open to that. The US does actually have a subsidy in the Inflation Reduction Act that applies to nuclear. Next generation geothermal is another possibility. Long duration storage, like pumped hydro in engineered systems, so you're not necessarily using existing river systems, is another possibility. natural gas with carbon capture and something called the alum cycle, which is close to true zero emissions, would be another possibility. In this analysis, the carbon capture pathway and a little bit of nuclear tend to win for that clean firm component, but that could be wrong. I mean, we don't know. I personally have been a real skeptic of the economics of nuclear, not for other reasons, just on economics. But you know, in the last couple of months, big tech companies have signed contracts for a new generation of nuclear plants. So I could be wrong. I don't know.
Thank you for being here. My question relates to the cost of biomass infrastructure, how it relates, for example, with other types of energy sources, especially like when you try to deploy this type of energy in, for example, other contexts. What are the main factors that should be met in order to this type of energy to be more cost effective?
Yeah, so that's a good question. Collection costs are very significant because it's a relatively low density. You have to collect over a large area to get enough biomass to produce hydrogen, say. So we factor that in, and that's factored into the supply curves that we used for this. The conversion technology, you know, different costs for different approaches. So traditional ethanol is a fermentation process that's been substantially optimized over the last 20 years of the renewable fuels program. So it's relatively low cost if you are starting with starch. As I said at the beginning, there was this hope that you would be able to convert cellulosic material, so including things like corn stover, into starch and then ferment it in the similar plants. The initial technology for that used high temperature, strong acids, and proved to be really problematic because of the kind of pre-processing. There is a new approach that the National Renewable Energy Laboratory has worked on that may make that cost effective. I don't think we have that really factored into this model at this point. The other basic pathway, well, two other basic pathways. One is pyrolysis, which is relatively cheap. You heat biomass up in the absence of oxygen. You can do that with a relatively small, like shipping container size device. So you could bring that to where the biomass is rather than having to collect biomass over a large area. That produces biochar, so basically pure carbon that's relatively stable. It could be a soil amendment, and a carbon-rich liquid, sometimes called bio-oil. There's a company that's trying to commercialize that technology called Charm. The idea would be to take the liquid and inject it into a Class 2 underground injection disposal well, and then sequester the carbon that way. So that's probably a relatively low cost if that technology matures. The other main pathway for conversion is through gasification, and those gasifiers have proved a little tricky to get commercial because of the variability of the biomass feedstock. But you know, again, there are companies that are trying to commercialize that approach as well. And then the final thing, the simplest, is, as I said, dig a big deep hole and bury it. That's low cost. That's why that comes out as a major part of our solution.
Test. Hi, thank you so much for your talk. I had two questions, one pertaining to, does the model account for perhaps implications on soil health by taking out that amount of biomass? And I know that there is also like pyrolysis is used to actually, as you mentioned, like improve soil health. So I was just wondering on that aspect. And then secondly, a lot of the policy that you mentioned pertains to like government. How is this like conversation being held in the policy level at perhaps like the more private side, like ICAO or SBTI? Thank you.
Yeah, great question. So the model itself doesn't include a soil carbon model. So we try to get at the soil health through the types of constraints that are put on the amount of biomass supply. So at least in principle, the amount of corn stover that we say is available accounts for leaving enough corn stover on the land to preserve soil health. The flip side on the biochar, we do view that as a carbon removal technology because we think that biochar is quite stable over hundreds of years. Something like 80–90% of the carbon there would stay sequestered out of the atmosphere. So we try to address that through the biomass supply curves. In terms of policy, yeah, it's a very active debate, particularly around aviation fuel. And in the private sector, you've got airlines that are advertising how they're going to be using more sustainable aviation fuel. United Airlines has hired Oscar the Grouch as their chief trash officer, and if you fly on them, you'll see on the jetway pictures of Oscar, very proud of converting waste to jet fuel. Two asterisks associated with that. One is they're not actually using waste right now, they're using corn ethanol. The other asterisk is it's less than 1% of the fuel that they're using. So, but the aviation industry kind of recognizes that they need to, that their social license to operate, particularly in Europe, I would say, is more advanced, requires them to be on a pathway to reduce their emissions. And as part of that, there is a very vigorous debate about whether crop-based fuels should be considered sustainable aviation fuel or not. In Europe, crop-based fuels are categorically excluded from counting towards their aviation fuel policy. In the US, they are allowed. Under ICAO, their methodology for calculating life cycle emissions is sort of a compromise. And they're probably not allowed, although they might be with carbon capture and sequestration. So it's a very active discussion. I would say based on attending an aviation fuel, a sustainable aviation fuel conference, most of the airlines are like, yeah, we would rather not use crops, but crop-based fuels is what's available now, and we're allowed to call it sustainable aviation fuel, so we'll use it.
Great, thanks, Dan. Maybe this is in spirit to Jim's question a little bit about what's the opportunity cost in terms of an acre that's not going into biofuels, and kind of another way you could view land use trends over time is that cropland is actually stabilized or declined in the US and China and India throughout Europe in terms of like the amount of acreage, and reforestation has increased and conservation lands have increased. And that, while there's certainly pressures in certain areas, like if, on the extensive margin, there's a world where over those next 50 years where we're not actually seeing that increased pressure on cropland, and perhaps even a decrease. How does that kind of change the calculation in terms of how we think about this and the marginal acre in biofuels?
Well, so I think I disagree with your premise. I think the data shows that we're continuing to expand global agricultural land. Africa is at the highest rate, but South America, this is still 1.5 million hectares over this most recent 5-year period here, 2016 to 2019. South America, Asia as well, even North America is above zero. So agricultural land is expanding globally. And we see that certainly deforestation rates. WRI has Global Forest Watch. It measures the amount of deforestation every year. Agricultural expansion is not the only factor, but it's still a major factor in driving deforestation. Our perspective is that the productivity gains, the ability to free up land, if we're able to do that by shifting to more plant-based diets, we need all of that in order to allow for restoration of natural ecosystems to compensate for agricultural emissions from methane, nitrous oxide, from from agricultural activities themselves. So we don't see a case for there being spare land.
Thank you. So at the end, you touched on several federal policy recommendations. I know that WRI also leads a great deal of work on subnational climate action. So I wanted to ask you, absent these federal policies, can you share more about what can be done at the city and state level, particularly given different jurisdictions?
Yeah. So at the state level, by far the most consequential policy is California's low carbon fuel standard. We have been engaged. They're in the middle of a rulemaking now. They're supposed to adopt an update to that standard that will tighten the requirements out to 2030. They're supposed to adopt that November, next week, the end of next week. And that has included a vigorous debate about crop-based biofuels, and in particular, until about 2 or 3 years ago, the qualifying low carbon fuels in California were some ethanol, particularly ethanol with carbon capture, and biodiesel and renewable diesel made from agricultural waste or from like used cooking oil. Starting about 2 years ago, basically, they had already locked up the entire available market of used cooking oil, and there's been a very rapid increase in the use of soybean oil renewable diesel. So there's two terms I'll just mention: biodiesel and renewable diesel. Biodiesel is when the oil is kind of converted directly into diesel fuel, and renewable diesel is it's processed processed in an oil refinery. Could be co-processed with conventional diesel. The end product is quite similar. They're chemically a little bit different. Renewable diesel is a full drop-in replacement for regular diesel fuel. Biodiesel, you can use up to, I think, 80% in most applications. But in any case, you're starting with a vegetable oil. And so we've been, along with a lot of other groups, have been urging California to put a limit on the use of virgin vegetable oils to qualify for credits under the low carbon fuel standard. They have, in their most recent proposal, included a limit that says that of the renewable diesel or bio-based diesel, renewable plus biodiesel, that any company can get credit for, no more than 20% of it can come from virgin vegetable oil. So at least they've acknowledged the issue. But the way that's written is it's not actually a hard cap. If you exceed 20%, then the credit that you get, then the carbon intensity score you get is equal to the emission benchmark requirement for that year. So it means you don't get a credit or a deficit. Whereas if it was counted with a full carbon opportunity cost of land, it would actually generate a deficit. So it's still providing some incentive for renewable diesel beyond the intended, the sort of nominal 20% limit. There's also some grandfathering, which I think means in practice that the limit is much looser than that. So I think it's not entirely clear how effective that will be, but I'm glad that they have acknowledged the issue. The next thing that we're going to really be trying to do is to get California to recalculate the carbon emissions assigned to crop-based fuels, either using ideally, from our point of view, using the concept of carbon opportunity cost, but even if they don't use that, they're currently using a model that's kind of at the low end of the range of the attributional or consequential LCA models. So, and other states are also considering or have adopted low carbon fuel standards. So Oregon and Washington has, New Mexico is implementing one. There's one under consideration in Illinois and maybe 2 or 3 other states. They tend to copy California because it's very complicated to implement these rules. So we think basically trying to get this right in California is the most impact we can have.
One more question.
Thanks so much for your talk. I was wondering if you think it'd be important to consider the opportunity costs of using waste and residue for an energy source. So, for example, I know in the agriculture context, farmers have a choice of using their crop residues either for production of organic fertilizer and compost or to use it to produce biochar. And oftentimes the economic and environmental case works out in favor of using it for the fertilizer. So not sure if we need to consider any of those like trade-offs and incentives.
Yeah, that's a very good question. Ideally, we should. I think, in all of these cases, the important question is sort of what is the counterfactual? If you're not using the whatever the biomass resources, even if it's a waste for carbon sequestration or hydrogen production or whatever it may be, what would happen to it otherwise? And if the answer is otherwise it would get burned in a pile and all the CO2 would go into the atmosphere, then there's not an opportunity cost associated with it. But for most of the other uses, there may be some opportunity cost, although I think, pretty clearly much lower than using dedicated land for crops.
So before we wrap up, let me note that we'll meet again 1 week from today, November 4th, here in Rubenstein 414. We'll be here for a talk by Holmes Hummel and Tamara Jones, the co-executive directors of Clean Energy Works. Holmes and Tamara will speak on inclusive financial solutions for faster energy transitions. And finally, please join me in thanking Dr. Lashof for his comments and insights today. Thanks so much, guys.